And start.
Hello, welcome to the Sandeman Museum Island Tour. My name is Beny Shlevich, and I will be your guide for the next 2 hours or so. So first of all, thank you for signing up and for joining me here at the Hakasher Market, one of the loveliest S-Bahn stations around the city. Just a few kind of frameworks so that we understand what's happening. This is a short distance walking tour. We're not going to try and cover all the bases. We're not going to try and cover all of the highlights of the city. The free main highlights tour of Sandeman is closer for that, so you might want to catch up with that as well. In fact, Sandeman offers an array of tours that covers different aspects of the history of the city. Today we're going to be focusing mostly on what we call the Museum Island, with the main highlights of, let's call it, the imperial period of the city's history. So we're gonna finish not far from the Museum Island U-Bahn station, which is a short distance walk from here in a direct line on Punta de Linden Street. Now, another thing is, if you're acquainted with these kind of tours, these are free tours. You're welcome to enjoy them free of charge, and you're welcome to tip your guide at the end if you enjoyed your tour. This idea is that we want everybody to be able to enjoy the history of the city. So just a couple of words about myself. My name is Beny. I'm 36 years old. I recently moved to Berlin, but I moved here from Israel, which was my previous country, where I was a tour guide for 8 years. So I have to say it's quite exciting to rediscover this city through the eyes of you guys, basically coming here and exploring the city with me. Of course, throughout the tour, if you have any questions, if you want me to go further into something, I'll do my best to either answer or make up a random answer, right? Hope that's clear. So that said, let's get go. Okay, so Museum Island is actually behind me, but before we dive into the specifics of the various beautiful buildings that we're seeing here, all this monumental construction, a bit of a really quick background about Berlin. Now, I'm a tour guide, so that means A, I love to hear the sound of my own voice, and B, I'm a history buff, but don't worry, I promise to get this over in 2 hours. Just really briefly, as you might know, Berlin actually started as 2 separate cities. Yeah, it started as Berlin on this side of the Spree River behind me, we're going to cross, and Köln on the other side, not to be confused with the city in West Germany called Cologne. Now, the first attested evidence we have of the city being here is 1247, but that's not going to be on the exam at the end, don't worry about that. And for the most part, I want you to imagine, we're here in a lovely autumn day, everything's nice, everything's beautiful, but Berlin was actually built on top of a marshy swamp. In fact, one of the original documents attesting to these grounds being purchased and processed calls this a marshy wasteland. Right, so I want you to imagine this sort of construction. We'll get back to the swamp as we go on through the tour. We'll see how that affects the city even to this day. That said, that probably gives us the source of the name of the city. So Berlin probably comes from a Slavic word meaning swamp in one of the forgotten Slavic languages. There's a common misconception that Berlin has to do with the bears that we're seeing all around us, but we'll get back to the bears, probably nothing to do with this. So while Berlin starts as basically a small frontier fort guarding the northern border of the Holy Roman Empire, this random collection of German-speaking principalities and duchies and all sorts of, like, an amalgamation basically of feudal times, so starting from medieval times. As a border station, the person in control of this area, the Margravate of Brandenburg, started amassing more and more power because they needed more and more soldiers to maintain the border. And as they started to do this, they quickly switched their seat of power from Brandenburg am Havel, which you can go and visit today. I recommend it; it's a lovely place. To basically this island that we're seeing behind us. And so we're seeing the first Schloss, the first palace in German. Right now we're seeing just the white wall behind the Berliner Dom, behind the grand cathedral that we're seeing here. This is the most recent reincarnation of that palace that's been there since the early 15th century. Now, a palace, of course, is the seat of kingly power, of imperial power. So while it starts from the palace, something called the electorate of Berlin, the Electorate of Brandenburg, it develops into the seat of the House of Hohenzollern. Now, as you can imagine from my accent, I'm not a native German speaker. If there are any German teachers present, I probably butchered that name. However, this was the royal house that controlled Berlin and slowly started expanding their power until later we hear them they call themselves the Kings of Prussia. Right? This is usually how we know them, and later on this becomes the seat of power of the German Empire, right? Or we could also what's known in German as the Reich, the first Reich, and all of this is centered behind the Berliner Dom, and of course this gives rise to everything that we're seeing around us, right? This is something I want us to remember. It's kind of easy to forget in today's world, although this is still true in today's world. A building is never just a building, and all the buildings that we're going to discuss, all of these beautiful monuments that we can of course discuss when they were built and who's the architect and what's the style and what they're trying to say and what's in them, of course. Keep in mind that building is always also a symbol. So when we're seeing signs of splendor, signs of beautiful craftsmanship, right? It's also a symbol of the power of the people who built them, who financed them, who organized this construction, and we'll be going back time and time again to the symbolic significance of these buildings and how they relate to each other. Okay, so this was the seat of imperial power of the first the Prussian kings and then the German emperors. All the way through 1918, through the downfall of the First World War, at the end of which the last German emperor abdicates from right here. We'll get back to him as well. And the German Empire is transformed into the Weimar Republic, also basically from right back here. Right? What happens in Berlin in the 20th century, we'll get back to that as we go further on. Right? Any questions so far? All right, thank you. So, welcome to the Friedrich Bridge. It's if you're trying to study the history of Prussian kings and emperors, it's very easy because they're all either named Friedrich or William or Friedrich William. So this was built at the end of the 19th century, connecting what used to be in the medieval times the two cities that merged into one, Köln that merged into Berlin in the early 16th century. We were right over the river Spree. It's the first time that we're seeing the famous TV tower, which basically you can see from all over Berlin. We'll get back to that as well, don't worry. But a word actually on this dome that you can see in the distance. So of course, when we're in the center, excuse the crow, he's also very interested. When you're in the center of any splendorous European city, you're going to see a lot of domes, a lot of magnificent construction, and always the seat of empires will attract such wealth, such architectural glamour, if you will. But that particular dome that we're not visiting on this tour, I do want to divert our attention because that dome, as you can see, is slightly different from, let's say, the cathedral, the Berliner Dom behind you. That's the dome of the Neues Synagogue, the new synagogue, right? Now the words Altes and Neues here are going to be very confusing, right? Because this is actually today the oldest, most important synagogue of the community. They used to be one of the Jewish community in Berlin. There used to be one older than that, but that was long demolished. I do, by the way, recommend you join the Jewish tour run by my colleague with Sandeman. You can learn all about that. But this synagogue, which was erected in the mid-17th century, originally, I should say, erected in the mid-17th century. It's different in style. It's probably trying to echo the Alhambra magnificent palaces in modern-day Spain. A time. Keep in mind that when this was built, the most successful Jewish, most prosperous Jewish community was in Spain. This was shortly after the Spanish Jewish Golden Age. And the relatively progressive Jews that were building synagogues at the time, they were kind of trying to connect to their ancient roots via Mediterranean architecture. Now this really magnificent synagogue, I really recommend that you go visit. It's going to be quite surprising if you go there today, because you come up to this facade, it's all incredible, and as you step inside you find out there's barely any synagogue left. And this is something that of course is a relatively common occurrence in Berlin. A lot of Berlin was basically either bombed out entirely or heavily suffered from the aerial bombardment campaign of the Allied powers, especially towards the end of the war in 1945. Now, the Jewish synagogue, the main Jewish synagogue, we would expect it to have suffered through the Kristallnacht, right? The main pogrom that was organized by that was pushed, organized, supported by the Nazi regime in 1938, that basically brought an end to peaceful Jewish existence within Berlin. Surprisingly, this synagogue survived Kristallnacht. Probably, as far as the research is still a bit hazy on that, probably on the account of two German, I should say, police officers whose precinct included the Jewish synagogue. And here's something quite unusual happened, since the German police force at the time was, of course, loyal to the regime, loyal to the Nazi regime. This is the height of power of the Nazi regime. You would expect them to make way for the pogromists, and in fact, perhaps join them. But sometimes police officers decided to draw a line in the sand, so to speak, and say, this is our turf. It's not so much that they were big supporters of the Jewish community, they just felt like this was their job to protect the community on their field. And since these two police officers basically protected with their own bodies the synagogue, it survived the Kristallnacht, unlike most of the synagogues and Jewish centers around the city that night. However, on account of the Jewish community first being concentrated in the ghetto and then later on in the war sent to concentration camps, the synagogue itself, the glorious synagogue itself, remained vacant. Around 1940, the Gestapo started using this, the German Nazi secret police started using this as basically an office building. And perhaps related to that, in 1943, the Allied powers bombed this building out. So in fact, such a beautiful state that we can see it covered with gold, actually shining in this rare autumn sun right now, follows a late reconstruction in the last decade. However, the Jewish community in Berlin is relatively small, the organized Orthodox Jewish community in Berlin. So this whole building was not renovated, it's just basically a husk, a shell, and a small museum, one of many, many Jewish museums in the city. That said, we're gonna step into the museum island itself, and we're gonna finally highlight that. Okay, so finally we find ourselves on Museum Island itself, or Museum Insel. So Museum Island, which is, as the name suggests, a small island on the river Spree surrounding us, is a collection that started developing organically and basically coalesced into one of the most impressive concentrations of German monumental construction, mostly from the 19th century, but also 20th and 21st century. And all of this has been declared as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1999 due to this concentration of cultural wealth, right? So keep in mind, when UNESCO declares something a World Heritage Site, it basically says this holds an important piece of human heritage regardless of whether or not you care about German history or not, right? And so, first of all, we should be considered lucky if we get a chance to see this up close. So we'll start by kind of diving into the different structures here. Keep in mind that on this tour we don't go into the buildings themselves, because if I will take you inside, let's say the Alte Nationalgalerie, we will be there all day because I'm a history buff. But I do very much recommend that you go and visit these museums separately. You can get a joint ticket, which will make it easier for you and cheaper for you. So the very first, museum that is part of the Museum Insel, Museum Island, is what we call today the Altes Museum. Can anybody guess what Altes means? Oh. It's old. It's the old museum. Whereas you can imagine at the time when it was open, it was never called the Altes. Same way as that the First World War was never called the First World War. It was the Königsmuseum, the King's Museum. It's that impressive neoclassical building that you see behind you over there. Well, don't worry, we'll get a look at its much more impressive facade a bit later on. And this was open in 1830. So when this is open, you have to keep in mind. So as I was saying, the first museum, that's museum, opened in 1830 at the command of Prussian King Frederick William III. Now keep in mind that when this museum is open, this whole concept of building museums is new, right? And it's new not just in Berlin, it's new throughout Europe. This whole idea that the masses should have access to cultural wealth, to beautiful paintings or beautiful pieces of architecture or archaeology or things like that is a new idea, right? This has to do a lot with basically shifts, deeper shifts within European society at the time, the rise of the middle class, for instance, which are non-wealthy, non-aristocrat people who do still want to have access to culture, right? There's also, keep in mind, a lot of fear. We tend to forget this today, but we'll get to that in a second. There is a rising fear of the aristocracy, and specifically the kings and the emperors, from their people, because there is a growing sense of liberalization sweeping throughout Europe, particularly Central Europe, such as Prussia. And the kings feel obliged to kind of respond in kind to the pressures of liberalization coming up from the peoples, right? So nobody's talking about abdication or deposition at the time, but the people need to be a bit more included in what's going on, and this includes the art as well. So a building like the Altes or Königsmuseum, as it was at the time, is a sort of valve, I would say, to let wider masses access cultural wealth, which before that was only accessible to, let's say, aristocrats who could go into a palace, that we will see a bit later on. And also, again, another way to project this imperial might, right? Because what is an empire, after all? If we're at the seat of an empire, it means we're at the heart of a much larger web that extracts resources from farther away places, right? And amasses them, of course, at the hands of the emperor, but also of all the, basically the metropole, the heart of the empire, right? So basically what we're seeing here is the result of a pumping of all sorts of wealth. Yeah, of course, in palaces in Europe you see this better, but at the time, research and science was very closely interlinked with the expansion of empire, right? A good attestation to that is if you were to go throughout all of these various museums that compose Museum Island today, and you'll start counting all the artifacts, where they actually come from, you'll see that a very small minority actually comes from Germany, right? So let's go on the list and see what one can see in each museum, right? We have the Altes Museum over there, right, which houses artifacts from all sorts of different places and periods. We have the Neues Museum over there, which was opened about 20 years later in 1855 at the command of the next guy, of course, Frederick William IV. As I mentioned, the exam at the end is going to be relatively easy. Then we have the National Gallery. Of course, this building now is called the Old National Gallery, which, while built in this neoclassical style, basically trying to pay homage to ancient Greco splendor, most of the stuff you'll see there is from different years, from different places around the world. Then there is the two magnificent museums that we cannot see from here. You could see them from the bridge earlier on. There's the Body Museum and the Pergamon. So the Body Museum is also basically this first phase built in the mid-late 19th century by Frederick William IV. Houses mostly Byzantine artifacts, right? Stuff that was found in the old, let's call it the older empire, what we would call today roughly around Turkey, yeah? And of course adjacent countries as well. And the Pergamon, which is probably the one I recommend the most go see. Sorry to bum you out though, because it's been undergoing renovations, going to keep undergoing renovations for about a decade more. So if you come back in around 15 years time, definitely go visit the Pergamon, which houses the magnificent Gate of Ishtar from Baghdad, and the Pergamon steps, just taken, hoisted away from Greece, from modern day Greece, right? So this was the kind of stuff that was not awkward at the time, made a lot of sense. At the time, Greece was non-existent, nobody cared about Greece, whereas Berlin was the seat of power. And so whenever somebody would go and discover something, for instance, when the ruins of Troy are discovered by a German archaeologist, right, the most magnificent bits and pieces that he finds, he just takes them to the heart of the empire that financed and pushed his project forward. By the way, a small side note is that if you speak to the people running these museums today, very esteemed, very lovely academians, obviously German for the most part, you'll hear that they're kind of angry that most of these collections are still intact, which is wonderful, having survived 2 world wars. However, there are some very, very important archaeological finds from the Pergamon, if I'm not mistaken, which have been taken by the Soviet occupiers here in the long course of East Germany, and are still housed in Moscow today, right? So it's interesting because these people are rightfully pissed off that some of what they consider German cultural heritage is still in Russian hands, has not been returned. But of course, originally, these artifacts were brought from countries that are today themselves pissed. Yeah? So we can see how these lovely symbols and lovely cultural sites of cultural heritage actually have a lot to do with cultural identity, national identity, and the tensions that arise from them, right? So let's get a bit closer and take another look at what's going on over there. So, from this angle we can see really well a dude and a horse. Yeah? Now, whenever you see a dude and a horse, that always bears a lot of symbolic significance. In this case, the dude on the horse is the Prussian Emperor Frederick William IV, who commanded these buildings being built, particularly the Altes Museum. From this angle, we can see better what always attracts our attention in these historical quarters, which is the statue of a dude on a horse. In this particular case, the dude on the horse is probably would be very offended if you heard me say dude on a horse. His proper title, excuse me, was the Prussian Emperor Frederick William IV. His actual title is much longer than that. And of course, his statue is up there because he commanded these buildings being built, which leads to the opening of the Neuest Museum, the new museum on my right, and what we call today the Old National Gallery behind me, opened in 1876. Now, Frederick William IV, who of course sat in the palace across the yard, across the Lustgarten over there that we're going to see in a minute, is remembered basically as one of the symbols of Prussian militarism and even ferocity, because he was the sitting emperor in 1848 during what we know as the Spring of Nations. Depending on where you went to school, you had never heard of this expression, or you know how critically important that was to the history of Europe as we know it today. This was a period of massive liberalization, democratization of many different communities around Europe. So there was a big procession, basically, a big demonstration of people who came out to his palace just across the road over there, demanding a constitution, demanding their voices be heard, demanding increasing democratization. At first he acquiesced, but then he broke his promises, basically, and ordered the Prussian military to crush the protesters, leading to basically a bloodbath. And so in German national memory, and particularly in Berlin national memory, those who know it a bit better, he's remembered as, on the one hand, as a patron of the arts, patron of the culture out here on the island, but on the other hand, as someone who basically swamped this particular island in blood in order to keep his throne, right? That said, I want us to take a closer look at the Neuest Museum on my right, and I want to ask a question that really should accompany you wherever you are in historical Berlin, with or without a guide. And the question is, where are the bullet holes, right? Because as you know, the Battle of Berlin in the winter and spring of 1945 was a ferocious battle, basically to the last man standing, all the way until Hitler's suicide, which of course you can hear all about in our other tours. And so buildings were heavily damaged, either by street-to-street fighting, and mostly from Soviet troops trying to invade the city. Keep in mind that the Soviets themselves lost around 70,000 troops, I think, only conquering Berlin, right, when the war was basically de facto finished. And of course, years of intense aerial bombardment, mostly by the Americans and the British. So whenever you see an old building or a historical monument, you should ask yourselves, well, where are the scars of war, right? In this case, we can see that the facade itself is relatively, let's call it a nice condition, but if you look a bit closer, you can actually see the bullet holes. You see the bullet holes, that's the first sign. This is not a vestige, not a random mock-up that was built up after the war, but rather either the original, yeah, we're being very careful with the word original in this tour, or a faithful reconstruction. In this case, this building stood ruined after the war all the way until 2008, if I'm not mistaken. So first of all, it goes to remind you that the reconstruction of Berlin, the salvaging of Berlin, first the clearing of the debris, and then the reconstruction of the buildings that were chosen to be reconstructed rather than just razed entirely, is a very, very long ongoing project. In many ways, it still is ongoing today, 2 generations after the war is finished. So this building was stood vacant all this time until they found the budget and the political will to reconstruct it and reopen it as an exhibition hall to all sorts of fascinating, mostly archaeological findings. As you can see right now, tomorrow is going to be the closing of the Elephantine exhibition on a fascinating island on the Nile River in Egypt. Yeah, any questions so far? Right, so if everybody's still feeling okay, I'm going to walk to the other side of this building. So, if you take a look behind me, the entrance to the James Simon Gallery, you'll see that's quite different from the other galleries you've seen, right? Everything else is neoclassic, very ornate, mid-19th century, basically let's call it ancient bling style, whereas this is much more modern looking, right? So I think you can guess. This was officially opened, the James Simon Gallery was officially opened in 2019, right? So it's the newest addition to Museum Island. Now, more than the building itself, which in a classic kind of postmodern style means there's not a whole lot to talk about architecturally speaking, in my eyes. Hope I'm not offending any modernist architects here. The name of James Simon is actually much more interesting in that sense. James Simon was a German Jew who lived in Berlin. He did a lot of things in his life, but we remember him here mostly as a patron of the arts. He's very much responsible for some of the coolest stuff that you can find in the other museums. For instance, the famous bust of Nefertiti, the Egyptian queen that you can see you will be able to see in the Pergamon Museum. That was mostly his doing, that he brought her to Berlin. He's also responsible for donating and acquiring a lot of the collections that we're seeing here. He passed away in 1932, so he missed out the worst that was to come on the German Jewish community. And he was one of those awkward thorns on the side of Nazi cultural propaganda, let's say, during their rise to power in the 30s. He was one of those people who's very hard to ignore, and yet it was also very hard to ignore the fact that he was Jewish, right? So the Nazis, when they were in control here, and we'll talk a bit about the Nazi role and what they were doing here, tried to basically erase him from history, but it was hard, right? They had a, let's say, limited success. Of course, following liberation from the Nazis in 1945, and more so after reunification and the kind of federal concentrated wealth and the reconstruction that this whole island is undergoing, his name is kind of forcefully brought back. In my eyes, that's a pretty good idea. We should kind of save these kind of characters from historical erasure, which is why the garden that we passed earlier is also the James Simon Garden, and the gallery is also in his name. So another thing that I would suggest that you do when you come back 15 years down the line, after you've seen the renewed Pergamon Museum, let's say you come here, visit on a cold winter day, which, as you know, is about 300 of these a year in Berlin on average, and you want to go from museum to museum without getting cold and wet, you'll be welcome to check out the new tunnel system that the municipality is currently working on. At least that's what the story that they're telling us. They're trying to connect all of the different museums of Museum Island via an underground network of pedestrianized tunnels. So with that said, let's go catch the last of the sun in the Lustgarten. Right, finally, as I promised, we're facing the facade. I know I've said it many times, but this is the magnificent facade of the Altes Museum. The first of the museums opened in what we call today the Museum Island, right? Long before this, the whole island was actually devoted in the mid-19th century to the preservation and advancement of arts and cultures. So, first of all, as you can see, again, paying homage to the Acropolis in Athens, paying homage to basically a fancified version of Greco-Roman culture, and projecting imperial might basically on anybody who's coming to visit these grounds. But maybe before we talk to the museum, let's take a look at the very simple park that we're in right now. This is called the Lustgarten originally, right? The Gardens of Pleasure, I believe is the correct translation. And surprisingly, for basically a meadow with some people picnicking, it holds a lot of very essential German history, or I should say it's the scene for a lot of important stuff that happened in Germany, right? So while this was set up as basically the kitchen gardens for the palace that you see behind you, the Berliner Schloss, which I will remind us has been here in some form or another from the early 15th century. So this is basically where the kitchens feeding these aristocrats were originally placed. Now keep in mind that kings, first electorates and then kings and then emperors in Christian nations. You see there's a lot of excitement from the younger generation as well regarding that. They rule at the behest of the Lord, basically. And so remember that we said that construction is always also a symbol, especially in imperial times. This is why the Berliner Dom, the cathedral, is also right here. So while this version of the cathedral that we're seeing here was completed in 1905, so you could say relatively new, in some form or another, that's basically here for as long as the palace was here, as the palace chapel originally, something much, much smaller, right? By the way, still a functional central Lutheran cathedral today, the Berliner Dom or Berliner Cathedral. Yeah, we'll get back to that in a second. So we have the cathedral, or the divine providence, basically, on one side. But if the divine providence is not enough, we also have the old armory on the other side, right? A bit more earthly might supporting the power of the emperor. So let's take another look at what's happening around us. We're in the middle between the seat of power, the actual seat of power, the Schloss, the palace. It's divine justification. It's military might ready to crush any protesters from within or from without, of course, invaders as well. And last, historically we could say this is last, this scientific justification and this connection to imagined early origins, right? Western European rulers always imagined themselves connected to Greco-Roman roots in a mythical sense. So the Lustgarten here was not always here, right? 1701, for instance, Frederick I, that we usually remember as Frederick the Soldier, assumes the throne, a Prussian king who was so interested in army and in militarization that when he couldn't fall asleep, he would have Prussian soldiers marching through his bedroom. Right? That was his particular thing. Now this is Berlin, so we respect everybody's preferences. But he uprooted the Lustgarten. He tore away all the nice grass and turned this into a parade ground. Right? The kings after him, they reinstate this, they plant this again. Another successful, sadly I should say, German militarizer, Adolf Hitler, in the 1930s, when he assumes power, also uproots these gardens and turns them into both parade grounds and a place to give speeches, right? So some of his famous speeches are given right from the steps of the Altes Museum behind me. I should perhaps say here, since it's the first time we're talking about the Nazis proper, that while this is the seat of power for the German nation, right? And when finally the Nazis managed to assume power in 1933, they do this from within Berlin. Hitler never really liked Berlin, right? He's quoted in his diaries as saying that the city is too leftist. And if we look at the results of the previous elections before the Nazis assumed power, let's say the last 3 elections, it was a succession of these elections in the late 1920s, early 1930s, we can actually see that the socialists and the communists had way more success in Berlin than they did elsewhere, right? So he had good reason to suspect Berliners and good reason to want to basically replace Berlin with something else. So we'll talk about that a bit later on. Please keep that in mind, right? So we have the museum, we have the cathedral. Now, if you take a look at the cathedral, you're going to see a scaffolding surrounding the great dome over there. You might also be able to see people from up there. So first of all, it costs, I believe, 10 euros to go up, climb about 300 steps. It's definitely worth the view. If you feel a bit more lazy, you can also take the elevator to the dome, reconstructed dome of the Humboldt Forum or the Berliner Schloss behind you. Pretty much the same view, but you don't get the sense of achievement. The scaffolding, however, has been there for as long as anybody can remember. Basically, the cathedral, like all the buildings around us, have suffered extensively during the Allied bombardment at the end of the war, 1944, 1945, and has been basically undergoing slow renovation ever since. Yeah. Another kind of reminder of the heavy price that Berlin, as a city, as a living organism, suffered during the war. I should say, a little tip, if you want to see the building but you don't want to pay the 10 euros, if you go there during service hours and you look like a good Lutheran, you'll probably be able to get in for free, but don't tell them I said that, alright? So, if there aren't any questions, we're gonna go across the street. So, we've crossed Lustgarten, and we're standing in front of something that we're going to have to find a proper name for. So we're going to start by calling this the Humboldt Forum, as it is known today. But before that, since we've mentioned the symbolic meaning of structures, we can't ignore the most symbolic meaning in all of Berlin. I guess the hardest to ignore, let's say, is the TV tower, right? The famous TV tower, which was built in the 1960s by the GDR, the East German government. So basically, it's just a way to transmit one of two short band AM and TV stations channels that were available at the time. But as you can imagine, this was not just there to improve the communication throughout the nation, but rather as a symbol to the might and success of the socialist government. It's also one of Germany's, obviously it's one of Berlin's symbols, goes without saying. You can see it on any postcard, any photo. Also, it's just very hard to ignore. You have to go really, really far out of the city to not see that. It's also one of the most visited tourist attractions out there, even though I think not really worth the money, but still quite impressive. Of course, it also features a rotating restaurant. It's modeled after Sputnik, right, the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth, which was launched into space a few years before that was built. And of course, another symbol of Marxist communist progress and basically scientific achievement, right? Those of you who saw this a bit earlier on in the day, we had a rare sunny day. You may have seen a shining cross up there, which was a coincidence created by how they created this kind of disco ball, which is, being Berlin, a lot of people just call this disco ball. But old school Berliners would call this coincidental cross the Pope's Revenge, right, on an anti-clerical stick. Right, so now that we've covered that, let's go back to kind of more classical stuff. The Humboldt Forum stands on the site, or is a reconstruction of, the original Berlin Schloss. So, as I mentioned, the Berlin Schloss had many different reincarnations. The first Schloss, much smaller than what you're seeing here, was built in the early 15th century. It was rebuilt time and time again, basically always enlarged and made much more fancy, I guess is the word, with the rise and progression of first the Electorate and Margravate of Brandenburg, eventually towards the height of the German Empire, right? So basically what we're seeing here is a reconstruction of the main facade as it was in the mid-19th century. So roughly, as you can imagine, the rest of these buildings that we're talking about in this period, so is the palace at this time. Now, why is it a reconstruction? Why are we not looking at the original? First of all, as you can see, there are no bullet holes, right? There's no scars of war. So already you know this is not original. But what happened to this is a bit more than just Allied bombardment. We're going to step inside. We're going to try to understand what's happening there. So follow me. So we're inside the Humboldt Forum, and to continue our story, as you can see from inside, this looks very different, right? This is not in the neoclassical, or I should say, properly Protestant Baroque style that we see on the outside in the mid-19th century. This is something new, yeah, modernist. So to go back to our story, this is the seat of power up until 1918, when the emperor abdicates. During 1918, there is what we call the German Revolution, which takes place mostly in Berlin. In fact, there are several competing revolutions. And so, on a fair autumn day in 1918, on the same day, there are two different proclamations of a new republic. Karl Liebknecht, one of the Spartacists, proclaims a new republic from one of the balconies of this building. In fact, the facade we just entered through. So keep that little fact in mind. And the competing communists in one of the balconies of the Bundestag proclaimed their own republic. So eventually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said the communist. I meant what later became the liberal Weimar Republic. Right? The Weimar Republic ends up winning, and this loses its both physical importance. Right? The parliament is seated here, but it's slowly becoming. Sorry. The parliament is seated in the Bundestag, of course. And so this building is sort of partially a museum, but really loses both the functional power and the symbolic power, right? Because if there's no kings, and if we don't want to have kings, if we're proud to be a liberal democracy as the Weimar Republic was, why do we care about ancient palaces, right? Now, when the Nazis assume power, this basically continues the same way, right? The Nazis don't really care about this building so much. However, this building is bombed twice by the Allies in April of 1945. But the building was built very, very sturdily. So while the building is bombed, suffers heavy damage, eventually is hit by incendiaries, the whole roof is blown away, and a massive fire breaks out, still the building is standing. Now, we haven't mentioned that, but this whole tour, this whole museum that we're going through, including this building, after the war, falls into the hands of the Soviet-controlled bloc, right? As we might remember from other tours, Berlin, after the war, is divided into 4 areas of influence, right? By the 4 winning Allied powers: the American sector, French sector, British sector, and Soviet sector, right? Within a few years, the 3, let's call them Western Allies, unify basically into one control, de facto, one control area, whereas the Soviet part falls behind what we call later the Iron Curtain, right? And later on, it becomes less and less accessible, leading up to the construction of the Berlin Wall in the 1960s. So all of this is within East Berlin. So in 1950, the newly formed East Berlin government, the GDR government, they're kind of scratching their heads thinking what to do about this. In fact, now we know they commissioned a secret report showing that they could reconstruct the palace, yeah? And either use it as a parliament, for instance, because the Bundestag itself is in West Berlin. I should say, strictly speaking, the Reichstag. Or demolish and do something else. And what they end up doing is demolishing it, doing something else, probably again because of the symbolic significance of this being the seat of Prussian military imperial might, right? Whereas socialist control is something entirely different. It was in fact so well built that even at its poor state, it took them, I believe, 16 tons of dynamite to actually blow the whole thing away, and the dome that we've seen before is the last one to go. It's really, really hard to demolish this whole thing. When they do end up demolishing this whole thing, they build in its place, after about 15 years later, they built the Palais de la République, the Palace of the Republic, which in common Soviet style at the time, we should say Soviet Marxist-Leninist style at the time, is both the House of Parliament, right? So the East German rubber stamp parliament, I should say, is seated over here. But it also has, let's see if I get the numbers right, 5 beer halls, a theater, a puppet theater, a bowling alley, several good restaurants, a movie theater, and I'm probably forgetting something else. This was a really, really fun place to hang out. Basically like a combination of the Reichstag today with the KaDeWe, with the Primark, yeah? Everybody came here to hang out. There was a huge parking lot in the front. This was very much open to the public. Yeah. It's kind of hard to imagine. I don't know of any other parliaments today in the world, whether in the liberal democracies or elsewhere, where it's such an accessible and fun place to hang out. Which is why, after German reunification in 1990, there's kind of a debate about what to do with this place, right? Because again, there's no need for it. The parliament is sitting in the Reichstag in the west. And it's kind of split along east-west lines, right? The eastern people are saying, let's maintain the Palais de République, let's use it as a monument, yeah? At least to the past it was here, sort of a museum, or perhaps keep the beer halls operating, why not? You know, Germans and beer. Whereas the Western inclined powers are saying, let's ruin this, let's destroy this, it's a miserable building, and erect the Schloss, the Prussian 19th century building instead. Eventually, they use a technical pretext. They find that even though it was illegal under East German law, this place is packed full of asbestos. Hopefully you don't know what asbestos is. It's a terribly, terrible carcinogenic material which was sadly used as a construction material for many, many years. They closed it to the public as a health hazard, eventually tear the Palais de République down, against protests, I should say, mostly from all the East German people who still remember this building fondly. And I should say it took 20 years of debate. And recreate in a sort of fanciful way, while on the outside we see again the Prussian facade, on the inside we see what the humbled form, which officially is known as a museum of the past, present, and future. So it's a free-to-access museum. I really recommend you check it out. There's still some restaurants, and as I mentioned, an elevator will take you up to the roof to have a really nice view of what we're seeing around here, right? If you're wondering what the Place de la République looked like, you can see this little orange line down here. That's one of the external walls of the building originally, and there are QR codes hiding somewhere over there, allowing you to see reconstructions of the Place de la République. Follow me out, please. So, one last word on reconstruction. Keep in mind that reconstruction debates, although they can seem really boring, also have a lot of interesting politics to them, right? I mentioned symbolic importance and power. I want you to take a look at the reconstructed Schloss, right? But now take a look at this building, which during GDR times would have been known as the building of State Council building, State's Business School. You see something odd about the business school over there. So it's all like modern style, quite boring buildings, but then there's the main entrance. Looks actually quite old. Looks mid-19th century, dare I say, Protestant Baroque style. It looks exactly like this facade over here, the entrance that we just came through to the Humboldt Forum. So here's something weird. The whole facade looks really nice, but it's reconstructed, as we've already discussed. It was only reopened in 2020. Whereas that particular piece, just that facade over there, is actually the original facade from the Schloss, which was taken from here before the GDR government raised the whole, what was left of the Schloss, and put it up as part of their state council, so a governing body. Why is this important? Because again, any kind of ruler, whether it's a socialist dictatorship or a Prussian emperor, needs to get the justification for the rule from somewhere. That facade is where Karl Liebknecht, who was a socialist, but it's close enough for the communist government. This is where he tried to proclaim his version of the new republic in November of 1918. Right? So they just preserved that piece of the building because that piece of the building is the symbolically important piece of history. Stuck it in there. It's surrounded with this, in my eyes, gaudy Soviet modernist structure. Right? Yeah. That said, we're gonna move on down Unter der Linden Straße, right? Which is a connecting axis basically from one side of Mainz, right? All these structures that we discussed, all the way down to the Brandenburg Tor on the other side, and of course the Reichstag building over there, right? Follow me, please. I need your eyes. Okay, so welcome to the last point in our tour. First of all, thanks so much for sticking with me so far. A word on the buildings we've crossed along the way. So of course this lovely pinkish building to my right is the Berlin Stadtoper. The first freestanding opera house in the world, I believe. This was the cause of an international crisis during the Cold War when an American officer really wanted to check out the Berlin Opera. And he believed that he did have the legal right to cross into East Berlin and come check it out, but for reasons of politics at the time was refused entry in Checkpoint Charlie. So if you've ever seen a magnificent photo of basically a column of American tanks facing a column of Soviet tanks at Checkpoint Charlie, this was over this guy's right to come see the Berlin Opera. So if you are so inclined, I do encourage you to come see it today, because look how lucky you are, you don't need to bring a column of tanks with you just to check it out. Now we've also crossed the pinkish building across the road, which today houses the Berlin Historical Museum, also being renovated at the moment. But the proper name for that is the Zaughaus, which is the armory, the old armory, standing right in front of the commander's house. So again, this controls the bridge that will take someone from the Unter der Linden right through the heart of power, right? The Schlossplatz, we should say. Oh, hello. The Schlossplatz. So of course you always need the army close by if you're an emperor, especially if you have a white promenade where the people can march through. There's also, of course, another dude in a horse that we saw from over there. That dude is again Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, Prussian Empire, which was very much admired by Hitler. And remember, again, we talked about the power of symbols. Hitler saw that as a very important symbol. So during the war, he actually had massive equestrian statue encased so as to protect it from aerial Allied bombardments. which is interesting because around him, especially during the last year of the war, the city was turned quickly into rubble, as we've already seen, but the horse actually survived, right? So you can see what Hitler cared about, what he did not care about. It's no coincidence, by the way, that he did not care for Berlin to be destroyed because he had a grand vision. His main architect already early on in the war planned was what was to be known as Germania, this megalomaniac, I guess we could say, reimagining of what Berlin was to look like, a hyper-futuristic Nazi city. Of course, this plan luckily never came to fruition. So we've passed by all of these symbols of power and importance. Of course, we're standing by two of the oldest buildings, the Humboldt Universität, and renamed after the two Humboldt brothers. We can see them on statues over there. But standing next to these symbols of science and research, and I could say culture, German culture in general, we will sadly finish our tour on a sadder note. We'll finish our tour at the site of the famous book burning that took place here at the behest of the Nazis by the Nazi students of Humboldt Universität itself, right, in 1933. So, of course, a big part of the Nazi ideology. A big part of Nazi ideology was a sort of anti-intellectualism, which was only directed towards the strands of intellectualism that the Nazis did not like. Now, that included, of course, anything that's remotely associated with Marxist thought, or just Marxist people, but also when the researchers were Jewish. As you can imagine, there were a lot of Jewish researchers in the history of German science. So what these Nazi students did, they basically grabbed any Marxist-associated, Jewish-associated book from the libraries, the extensive libraries of the Universität, as well as the whole archive of the Department of Sexology, which was a world-famous, very advanced, relatively liberal thinking at the time department. All in all, about 20,000 books were burned at the square right here. Today the square is called Babelplatz. They were burned here in a harrowing sort of symbol of what was about to come later on. And accordingly, we have a difficult to spot quote by Heinrich Heine here, who said this 110 years earlier. Basically, we can translate this roughly as saying, where they burn people, when they burn books, that place someday they will burn people as well. So a tragic foreshadowing, you could say, of what was to come in the height of the Nazi regime. I invite us to also step into a little illuminated cube, which luckily has been cleaned now. If you take a look over there, you'll see a memorial to this book burning, a very kind of nondescript memorial. You'll see there are basically a lot of empty bookshelves. And if you count the spaces, you'll see there's space for about 20,000 books, so about the same amount of books that were burned on the fateful night. Coincidentally, this memorial, which was opened only in 2009, so like many of the memorials to the war that we're seeing around here, it's relatively recent. This one was designed by an Israeli artist, Micha Ullman, a well-known artist and a well-known achievement. I should say, from a personal point of view, it's quite interesting to see how the German official authorities remember their history of the war. Unlike other places in Europe, you do confront it, but you will notice that the memorials, of course, the most famous of them being the memorial to the murdered Jews, next to the Brandenburg Tor over there, and the memorial to the murdered Sinti and the homosexuals, not far from there in Tiergarten. They're all there, but all relatively hidden from view. They're not advertising themselves. There's no plaque here. There's no sign here. You basically need a tour guide. So it's interesting, this choice to kind of have it present in the public space, but not in your eyes. Yeah? So with that said, this brings our tour to a conclusion. So just as a reminder, we started from Hackescher Market 2 hours ago. We've discussed briefly the history of Berlin in general, and we dived into the specifics of Museum Island, the various museums that compose it, the cathedral, the Humboldt Forum, the Berliner Schloss, vis-a-vis all the history basically of German imperialism and Prussian imperialism, and we've ended with the tragic book burning right here. So, I've been Beny with Sound on Tours. If you've enjoyed my tour, This will be a good time to tip your guide if you enjoyed it. If you haven't enjoyed it, then please don't tell anyone, all right? And I hope to see you on some other tour here. Thank you very much. Goodbye.